Hi friends, welcome to the Share, Invite, and Proclaim channel. My name is Judy. I want to continue in this series on the small little letter of James, couched between the book of Hebrews and 1st and 2nd Peter. And it is a letter that James, the brother of Jesus, the pastor of the Christian church in Jerusalem, about AD 62. It's a letter that he wrote to other Jewish believers spread across the Mediterranean. And he, in chapter 1, talked about some advice. He gave advice about trials, wisdom, wealth, temptation, good gifts, and true religion. And then we'll talk about chapter 2 today, and it's the warnings against favoritism and faith without works. My throat is a little dry because I just had a huge glass of milk, and it was good, but it made my mouth dry. So James chapter 2, he warns against favoritism and faith without works. Well, how will our actions be judged? By the law of liberty? Well, remember that the law of liberty is that you're bound to Christ, but you're liberated to abundant life. Paul puts it this way. He says in Romans that we're not under the law, but we're under grace. And believers are free from the slavery of sin and death. Unbelievers are not. And Jesus said that you will know true believers by their faith. Well, think about the audience of first century, the Christian church in Jerusalem, about AD 62. They were poor, of course, but also some were Pharisees. We read in Acts chapter 15, verse 5, that those that believed that Jesus was the Messiah were quite wealthy, and they were rich compared to the other poor in the church because they wore robes. They were joined by Jews who said that believers had to be circumcised. They had to follow the law of Moses in order to be saved. And this was a big deal. It was a debate. It was what James calls a dissension. I think they were ready to fist fight physically over this whole thing. It was that much of a big deal. Well, in other words, these Jews were saying that you had to become Jewish in order to be saved. Peter got up and he said, God gave the Holy Spirit to these Gentiles just like he did to us. There's no distinction between us and these Gentiles who have the Holy Spirit. So James got up and he ruled that these Gentiles who believed in Jesus would not have to be circumcised. And he used Isaiah 45:21 as his thinking. So James spoke to both groups about favoritism. He said to the Pharisees, he said, don't think that your faith in Jesus has any special treatment. You have an attitude of personal favoritism. And to others, like the elders of the church, he said, well, don't treat the wealthy, those that have a gold ring or fine clothes, don't treat them with favoritism. Give them the best seat in the house and tell the other poor, well, you go sit over there by the door and you sit down here at my feet. He said, when you do this, leaders, you're showing favoritism and you become judges of evil motives. What is your motive for doing that, for that partisanship? What could these evil motives be? Well, Jesus said, John 7, not to judge according to appearance, but according to righteous judgment from the heart. have pure motives, to practice kindness and compassion. Zechariah 7:9. Also, Jesus told the Pharisees that they judged according to the flesh. They judged the helpless, the poor, the stranger, just according to the flesh, according to their outward appearance. Verse 5, James says that God chose the poor to be rich in faith. Well, they know they need God. They're heirs to the kingdom, which is promised to those that love him. The wealthy who have evil motives oppress the poor. They take them to court and they blaspheme God's name. Another drink here. Verse 8, he says to fulfill the royal law. The royal law is that you shall love your neighbor as yourself. You know, Mark tells us in Mark 12 that a scribe asked Jesus, what was the greatest commandment? And Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second is to love your neighbor as yourself. Well, what does that mean? Love your neighbor as yourself. Well, perhaps Leviticus 19, 9 to 18 gives us specific examples in their culture. Leave the corners of the field so that others can come by, the poor can come and glean from the corners of the field. Or in your vineyards, don't pick up the fruit that has dropped to the ground. Let it stay for those who are poor and the stranger who need food. Don't steal or deal falsely or lie to one another. Don't swear falsely by God's name. Don't oppress your neighbor, nor rob him. Pay the hired worker his wage that day. Don't wait until the next day. He may need that for food. Don't curse a deaf man or cause the blind man to stumble. No injustice in judgment. No favoritism to either group, poor or wealthy. Don't slander. Don't act against the life of your neighbor. You can gently correct your neighbor, but reprove, not hate. Do not take revenge nor keep a grudge against your countrymen. Love your neighbor as yourself. So what I see in that list in Leviticus is that provide food when it's needed. Care for the poor and the needy. Treat others the way you want to be treated. And treat people's needs, not their economic status. Because the wealthy and the poor have needs, whether they be physical, emotional, or spiritual. Chapter 2, verse 11 of James, God said, do not commit adultery. But he also said, do not commit murder. And if you commit one of these, like maybe murder, you're guilty of both and have broken the law of Moses. You know, we today typically like to put sins in a hierarchy. Adultery is not as bad as murder. Favoritism is not as bad as adultery or murder. Forgetting to be a doer of the law is not as bad as adultery, murder, or favoritism. Not taming or restricting your tongue is not as bad as adultery, murder, favoritism, refusing to be a doer of the law, and having an uncontrolled speech. Having no mercy towards others is not as bad as murder, adultery, favoritism, untamed speech, not a doer of God's law. But God said that if you are guilty of one, you're guilty of all. Verse 10, for whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles in one point, he has become guilty of all. Jesus said in Matthew 24:23, he said to the scribes and Pharisees that they tithe, but they neglect the weightier provision of the law, which is justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Now let's go to that touchy subject of faith and works. This has been an issue for thousands of years. And the person I think that best describes the differences between James and Paul and what they are teaching is Foy Valentine, who has this little tiny commentary on 1st and 2nd Peter, Hebrews, and James. Well, James says in verse 17 of chapter 2, faith without works is dead. He also says in verse 20, faith without works is useless. And I think again in verse 26, for just as the body without the spirit is dead, so also faith without works is dead. And then James gives 2 examples. He said, verse 21, Abraham was justified by works when he offered up Isaac his son on the altar at Mount Moriah. Abraham had faith, he believed in God, but his work was to obey God and take his son, here's the action, take his son Isaac to the mountain, build an altar, and put Isaac on top of it. In Genesis 22. And then he gives an example of Ahab. She believed in God, but her action was to hide the spies and then send them another way so that they would not get caught. Another example of a person who had faith, but they had action that followed their faith or showed that their faith was there. True faith versus false faith. And this issue has been debated for centuries. And Valentine explains that James and Paul look at the issue differently. He said on page 79, dead faith assumes that attention to good works is not important. Dead faith assumes that accepting monotheism can make a person right with God. Faithful Jews for thousands of years have believed in monotheism. The Shema from Deuteronomy 6 says, Hear, O Israel, our God is one Lord. The knowledge that God is one is even shared by demons, he said in verse 19. They tremble in terror, but do not act on the basis of that knowledge. These devils are not atheists. They know that God exists. They're in trouble with God because they've not matched correct knowledge with right actions. For sinners to believe something about God is not enough, James says. We must believe God and choose to be in a life committed to Jesus as Lord. Faith and works, he says, are 2 sides of the same coin. They are partners, not rivals. They are complementary, not contradictory. He explains this so well that I'm going to quote from his book. Page 78 and 79. James and Paul approached faith and works from different points of view. James' view was essentially pastoral, while Paul's view was strictly missionary. James saw faith and works in light of what God requires of those who have already become Christians, while Paul saw faith and works in the light of what God requires for the person to become Christians. James was concerned about the fruits of a Christian experience, while Paul was concerned about the roots. As a pastor, James gave special attention to living the Christian life, while Paul, the evangelist, gave special attention to becoming or the beginning of the Christian life. James and Paul approached faith and works with different opponents in mind. The opponents of James were ethical relativists, moral anarchists, antinomians, who taught moral conduct was inconsequential because they mistakenly imagined that inward faith was all that was necessary. The opponents of Paul were legalists who believed that moral conduct could secure the favor of God without converting to Christ. Furthermore, James and Paul approached faith and works in significant differences in their usages of the 2 words. Faith was used by James to mean the giving of intellectual assent to the facts of Christianity, an assent that was barren of good works, inactive, and therefore useless. Faith was used by Paul, on the other hand, to mean saving faith in Jesus Christ, which faith issues normally and naturally in works of righteousness. Works is a word used by James to mean acts of ministry, mercy, love, and justice done in obedience to the demands of God's Spirit. Paul, on the other hand, used the word works to mean acts performed legalistically in obedience to the letter of the law in order to earn salvation. Justification is the term used by James to refer to the believer's final acceptance by God at the last judgment, while Paul used the word to mean God's immediate acceptance of any sinner who repented and believed in obedience to the call of the gospel. So I think that is the best example, I think, that I've found of the differences between Paul and James in this idea of works, faith and works. Well, I mentioned that in the first video that I wanted to identify the commands that is written in James. In chapter 1, gosh, there were 24 or so, almost half the number. Well, I found about 6 in chapter 2. Avoid an attitude of first personal favoritism. Verse 8, love your neighbor as yourself. Verse 9, do not show partiality to others. Verse 11, do not commit adultery or murder. Verse 12, speak and act as those who are judged by the law of liberty. And verse 20, faith without works is useless. There's a lot there and a lot to think about, especially when you read a lot about Paul and his view of faith and works. And again, I like Valentine's interpretation that they're sides of the same coin, faith and works. And so it's pretty heavy stuff, and so I pray that you will read it and think carefully about the subject. And chapter 3, we'll talk about the tongue and the fact that your tongue can be positive and it can be negative. It can be a source of blessings and also a source of curses. So it will be an interesting study. I pray that if you need the Lord, that you think about Romans 10:9, that if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. And I pray that you'll go to a Bible-believing church where you hear about Jesus, who he was, who he is, and who he will be at the second coming, and that you find a Bible-believing small group where you can fellowship with other believers, you can learn from them, you can grow, and be in Christian fellowship. Thanks for watching, and we'll look forward to seeing you in the next video.